The Mitsubishi A6M0 banked through the morning clouds, and suddenly the world below me exploded into impossibility. Through the scattered whiz of vapor, an American city spread beneath my wings like nothing I had ever imagined possible. Clean streets stretched in perfect grids. Automobiles moved in orderly lines along paved roads. Children played in green parks beside red brick schools. Families walked along sidewalks lined with trees I couldn't name. Electric scenes flickered above storefronts that gleamed with abundance I had been told didn't exist in this crumbling nation. My hands froze on the control stick. The engine's familiar rhythm suddenly sounded foreign in my ears. This wasn't the America they described in our briefings, a nation of poverty, chaos, moral decay, ready to collapse under its own corruption. Below me was order. Prosperity. Life continuing in peaceful abundance that made my own war-torn homeland seem like a distant, impoverished dream. I didn't know then that this view would break something inside me that could never be repaired. If you're here to hear this story, stay with me until the end. Subscribe and tell me where you're watching from, because these memories need to survive. To understand why seeing an American city shook me so deeply, we need to go back to the beginning, to a rice farming Kyushu where everything I thought I knew about the world was first planted in my young mind. I was born in 1923 Pulgadas, a village in Kyushu where most families, including mine, struggled to grow enough rice to survive the harsh cycles of flood and drought that defined our agricultural existence. My father worked fields that belonged to wealthy landowners who lived in distant cities, earning barely enough to feed our family of six and pay the rent on land his ancestors had farmed for generations. We lived in a wooden house with paper screens that couldn't keep out winter's bitter cold, sleeping on tatami mats that grew threadbare with years of use, their once green surface faded to gray. During winter months, we'd huddle together for warmth, burning whatever wood we could gather from the surrounding hills. My mother mended our clothes until the patches of their own, her fingers working by candlelight to extend the life of fabric that should have been replaced years earlier. Our meals consisted mainly of rice when the harvest was good, supplemented with vegetables from our small garden and occasionally fish from the river that ran past our village. During bad years, we'd mix sawdust with what little rice we had, creating a paste that filled our stomachs without providing real nourishment. I remember the constant ache of hunger, the way it made everything else in life seem less important than the next meal. My younger sister died during the winter of 1934, not from any specific illness but from the general weakness that comes from never having enough food, enough warmth, enough of anything except hope. At school, which consisted of one room and one teacher for 40 children of various ages, our education focused heavily on loyalty to the emperor and understanding Japan's place in the world. Our teacher, Yamato-sensei, was a former soldier who had lost his left arm in Manchuria but retained his fierce dedication to the empire. He explained why we suffered while others prospered, why honest families like ours struggled while foreign nations enjoyed abundance they hadn't earned. America, they told us, had grown fat and lazy on stolen belt, exploiting Asia while preventing Japan from accessing the resources we needed to survive and flourish. The Americans attacked the Philippines, controlled trade routes that should have been open to all nations, and used their naval power to enforce an economic system that favored Western countries while keeping Asian nations in poverty. They showed us propaganda films depicting American cities as places of moral corruption, where families fell apart because of materialism, where crime flourished because people had lost their spiritual connection to duty and honor. The Americans were weak, they said, corrupted by materialism and individual selfishness, lacking the spiritual strength and collective discipline that made the Japanese race superior. They'd grown soft from easy living, dependent on machines rather than developing the human spirit. When war came, their lack of Bushido spirit would make them easy to defeat. They would surrender quickly rather than fight with the dedication and honor that defined the Japanese character. These lessons came with maps showing how American policies had created artificial shortages of oil, steel, and other resources that Japan needed to develop and prosper. If we could break American control over these resources, our village could have electricity, modern farming equipment, enough food for everyone. The poverty we endured wasn't our fault, it was the deliberate result of American economic warfare designed to keep Asian nations weak and dependent. I believed every word because it explained our poverty, our hunger, our fathers' bent back and calloused hands that never seemed to heal from their daily labor. If America was wealthy, it was because they had stolen what rightfully belonged to us. If we were poor, it was because they prevented us from achieving our destiny as the leading nation of Asia. If my sister had died, it was because American policies had created the scarcity that made survival so difficult for honest farming families. The logic was simple, clean, and gave meaning to our suffering that made it bearable. When he was 15, a military recruiter visited our village during the autumn rice harvest. He arrived in a polished automobile that attracted every child in the village, wearing a crisp uniform that seemed impossibly clean compared to our work clothes. He spoke of honor, of serving the emperor, of finally claiming Japan's rightful place in the world and ending the poverty that had defined our lives for generations. For a farm boy whose greatest aspiration had been inheriting his father's debt and the endless cycle of planting and harvesting that defined village life, military service offered something he'd never dared imagine, the chance to fly. He'd seen aircraft passing overhead like silver birds, usually military planes heading toward from training bases, and dreamed of escaping the rice paddies that seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction. Flying represented freedom from the mud, the backbreaking labor, the constant worry about weather and crop prices and whether we'd have enough food to survive another winter. In the air, he imagined, a man could be truly free. At 17, he enlisted despite my mother's tears and my father's resigned nod. The first team I saw a Zero fighter up close at the training base near Osaka, my breast caught in my throat. The aircraft was beautiful in a way I couldn't articulate, sleek aluminum skin polished to mirror brightness, engine cowling shaped with mathematical precision that seemed almost artistic. The cockpit looked like it belonged in the future rather than 1941, filled with instruments and controls that represented technological sophistication far beyond anything I'd encountered in rural Kyushu. Standing beside that machine, I felt connected to something larger than myself, something that could lift me above the rice paddies and poverty and into the sky where heroes lived. The Zero represented everything modern Japan could achieve when freed from the economic constraints imposed by Western powers. It was proof that Japanese engineering and craftsmanship could create something superior to anything America produced. Zero pilot training was the most brutal experience of my young life, designed to break weak recruits and force the survivors into instruments of the emperor's will. Instructors screamed at us from before dawn until after dark, struck us for minor mistakes, demanded perfection that seemed impossible to achieve. We learned to fly by instinct, to fight with aircraft that responded to our thoughts as if they were extensions of our own bodies. The physical training was intense, running, calisthenics, martial arts practice that left us exhausted and covered in bruises. But the psychological training was harder. We learned to suppress individual desires in favor of group loyalty, to accept death as preferable to failure, to view our lives as completely expendable if sacrifice could advance the empire's goals. The Zero was faster, more maneuverable than any American fighter, they told us repeatedly. American pilots were soft, under-trained, dependent on heavy armor and multiple engines because they lacked the skill and spiritual strength to survive in single-seat fighters. We studied American aircraft specifications and laughed at their clumsy designs. The P-40 Warhawk was too heavy and slow. The P-39 Airacobra had its engine mounted behind the pilot, a configuration so awkward it proved American engineers didn't understand basic aviation principles. When they finally developed newer fighters, they'd still be flown by pilots who lacked Bushido spirit, who would flee rather than fight to the death. Friends died during training, aircraft failures, pilot errors, accidents that killed young men whose names I can still recite 50 years later. Takeshi Matsumoto, who'd grown up in Tokyo and could read 3 languages, killed when his engine failed during a practice dogfight. Hiroshi Sato, a farmer's son like me who'd joined for the same reasons, lost when his Zero spun into the ground during formation flying practice. Kenji Watanabe, who'd planned to become a teacher after the war, burned to death when his aircraft caught fire during gunny practice. But that only reinforced the importance of our mission and the superiority of those who survived the training. We were the sword of the empire, trained to perfection, ready to prove Japanese superiority over the decadent Americans who had grown weak on unearned prosperity and lost the warrior spirit that once made them formidable opponents. The mission briefing that changed everything came in early 1943, during a period when the war news had become increasingly unclear and contradictory. Our commanding officer, Colonel Yamamoto, stood before a map of the American West Coast that showed details he'd never seen before: cities, roads, military installations marked with symbols he didn't recognize. The briefing room felt different that morning, filled with attention he couldn't identify but could definitely sense. Reconnaissance mission, he announced, his voice carrying the authority that made questioning impossible. Intelligence gathering on enemy coastal defenses and urban infrastructure. pointed to coordinates of the California coast with a wooden pointer that clicked against the map with mechanical precision. Weather conditions favorable. Limited fighter opposition expected based on recent intelligence reports. Something in his tone suggested information was being withheld, details that might be important but weren't considered necessary for US to know. Other officers stood along the walls, taking notice, their expressions carefully neutral in the way that indicated they'd been briefed separately. The mission seemed straightforward: fly to the American coast, observe and photograph military installations, return with intelligence that would help plan future operations. But there were gaps in the briefing that made me uncomfortable. Why send only 2 aircraft on such a long-range mission? What specific intelligence were we supposed to gather that hadn't been collected by previous reconnaissance flights? Why were we being briefed separately from the other squadrons who usually participated in major operations? Lieutenant Sato, my wingman, raised his hand tentatively. Sir, what about civilian areas? Are we to avoid populated zones? The question in the air like smoke. Colonel Yamamoto's expression hardened slightly, the way it did when someone asked questions that touched on matters beyond their rank. Lieutenant, your mission is reconnaissance of military significance. Civilian areas are irrelevant to your objectives. The answer was technically correct but felt incomplete, as if we were being told only enough to complete our mission without understanding its larger context. But questioning superior officers wasn't a part of our training, and the briefing continued with technical details about fuel consumption, navigation waypoints, and emergency procedures if we encountered American fighters. We launched before dawn, my Zero loaded with extra fuel tanks for the long flight across the Pacific Ocean. The takeoff was smooth, the aircraft lifting into darkness that seemed to swallow our exhaust flames. Lieutenant Sato formed up on my right wing, his aircraft a darker shadow against the stars that were beginning to fade as dawn approached from the east. The engine's reliable rhythm became the soundtrack to my thoughts as he flew east toward the rising sun, then northeast toward the American coast that lay somewhere beyond the horizon. Below me, the Pacific Ocean stretched endlessly, dark blue fading to lighter blue at the horizon where sky and water met in a line so perfect it might have been drawn with a ruler. Cloud formations cast shadows on the water like islands that existed only in my imagination, constantly changing shape as wind currents moved them across the sky. The Zero performed flawlessly, its controls responding to the slightest pressure, engine maintaining perfect pitch that indicated all systems functioning within normal parameters. This aircraft represented the pinnacle of Japanese aviation technology: light, fast, maneuverable enough to outfit any enemy fighter. Flying it felt like wearing a perfectly fitted suit, everything designed to extend the pilot's natural abilities rather than compensate for weaknesses. Hours into the flight, doubt began growing in my mind like as if finding fertile soil in previously barren ground. The propaganda had always seemed so certain, so absolute in its judgments. Americans were weak, their nation crumbling, their people demoralized by materialism and corruption that had destroyed their fighting spirit. But why, then, were they fighting so effectively in the Pacific? Why were their pilots, supposedly untrained and cowardly, shooting down our best aviators with increasing frequency? Why was this war taking so much longer than our leaders had predicted? They'd told us the Americans would sue for peace within months of Pearl Harbor, that their decadent society couldn't stand a prolonged conflict. But 18 months later, American resistance seemed to be strengthening rather than weakening. Their industrial production was increasing rather than collapsing. Their military forces were growing larger and better equipped rather than smaller and demoralized. The questions multiplied as the flight continued, each one leading to others that I'd never allowed myself to consider. If American pilots were truly inferior, why did they keep developing new aircraft that seemed to match our capabilities? If their nation was truly collapsing from internal weakness, why could they simultaneously fight wars in Europe and the Pacific? If their people truly lacked fighting spirit, why were they accepting casualty rates that would have demoralized a supposedly weaker society? Lieutenant Sato's voice crackled through my radio. Coastline in sight. He looked ahead and saw the American mainland appearing first as a thin line on the horizon, then resolving into details that contradicted everything he'd expected to see. No chaos visible from our altitude. No visible signs of poverty or social collapse. No evidence of a nation struggling to maintain order or basic infrastructure. Instead, it showed organization, roads that appeared to be paved and well-maintained, buildings arranged in patterns that suggested planning and prosperity, harbors filled with ships that indicated active commerce rather than economic collapse. The coastline looked functional, prosperous, organized in ways that contradicted every briefing they received about American weakness and social decay. Then it descended through the cloud layer, and the world exploded into truths that shattered everything it thought it knew about America and the war we were fighting. The city below me was a revelation that stabbed my breast and froze my hands on the controls like a physical blow to my consciousness. Streets laid out in perfect grids, each one wider and cleaner than any road I'd seen in Japan, including the major thoroughfares in Tokyo and Osaka. Houses with green lawns that seemed impossibly lush and well-maintained, cars parked in neat driveways that suggested individual prosperity far beyond anything I'd known was possible. Children playing in yards that seemed impossibly spacious, with swings and bicycles and toys scattered across grass that was maintained purely for recreation. Schools built of red brick, larger and more solid than anything I'd seen in my homeland, surrounded by playgrounds where hundreds of children could exercise and play simultaneously. Baseball fields with manicured grass where teenagers played what looked like organized games, the diamond patterns visible from thousands of feet above. Storefronts with bright electric signs advertising products I couldn't read but could see were abandoned, buried, accessible to ordinary citizens rather than reserved for wealthy elites. This wasn't a nation struggling for survival or rationing basic necessities. This was prosperity beyond anything I'd been taught to imagine, abundance that made the poverty of my village seem not like temporary hardship caused by American economic warfare, but like the natural result of living in a less developed part of the world. The contrast between what I saw and what I'd been told was so stark it created a physical sensation in my chest, a crushing weight that made breathing difficult and thinking clearly almost impossible. These people weren't suffering under the oppression of a collapsing system. They weren't weak or corrupt or ready to surrender. They were living lives of abundance that made my own homeland struggle seem like the problems of a poor country trying to compete with something far more advanced and sophisticated. Everything, the infrastructure, the organization, the visible prosperity, contradicted the fundamental assumptions that had justified our war effort. The families walking along sidewalks below looked healthy, well-dressed, purposeful in ways that suggested they weren't worried about basic survival. Children rode bicycles on paved sidewalks that extended for blocks in every direction. Women pushed baby carriages through neighborhoods where every house appeared to have electricity, running water, probably telephones and radios that connected them to information from around the world. Men drove automobiles that gleamed in the sunlight, models I'd never seen because such advanced vehicles had never been available in Japan. Tears formed in my eyes, though I couldn't immediately identify whether they were tears of shame, anger, or simply overwhelming disbelief at the magnitude of the lies I'd been told. Everything I'd believed about America, about the war, about why we were fighting, all of it was propaganda so disconnected from reality that believing it had made me complicit in something fundamentally wrong. The poverty of my village wasn't because Americans had stolen our wealth through economic manipulation. It was because Japan itself was a poor nation, less developed, less prosperous, trying to compete with a country that had achieved something we hadn't even understood was possible. My aircraft's engine continued its steady rhythm, but it felt like it was falling through space without any support or reference points. The ground beneath me represented not an enemy to be defeated but a way of life so far beyond my experience that I couldn't process it emotionally. How had my leaders known about this abundance and still convinced us that America was weak and collapsing? How had they seen this prosperity and told us it represented corruption and decay? The radio crackled with Lieutenant Sato's voice. Target assessment complete. Ready to return to base. But I couldn't move, couldn't respond, couldn't break away from observing this impossible reality that was reshaping everything I understood about the world. Below me, ordinary people were living ordinary lives in extraordinary abundance, unaware that a Japanese pilot was having his entire worldview destroyed by simply witnessing their peaceful existence. If this moment hits you as much as it hit me, tell me in the comments. It helps keep these stories alive. The families walking along sidewalks below looked healthy, well-dressed, purposeful. They weren't the demoralized people I'd been taught to expect. They were living ordinary lives in extraordinary comfort. Children rode bicycles on paved sidewalks. Women pushed carriages through neighborhoods where every house had electricity, running water, probably telephones. Men drove automobiles that gleamed in the sunlight, models I'd never seen because they'd never been imported to Japan. Tears formed in my eyes, though I couldn't immediately identify whether they were tears of shame, anger, or simply overwhelming disbelief. Everything I'd believed about America, about the war, about why we were fighting, all of it was lies. The poverty of my village wasn't because Americans had stolen our belt. It was because Japan itself was a poor nation, less developed, less prosperous, trying to compete with a country that had achieved something we hadn't even understood was possible. My aircraft's engine continued its steady rhythm, but it felt like it was falling through space without support. The ground beneath me represented not an enemy to be defeated but a way of life so far beyond my experience that I couldn't process it. How had my leaders known about this abundance and still convinced us that America was weak? How had they seen this prosperity and told us it was collapse? The return flight passed in psychological chaos. I replayed images of the city over and over, trying to reconcile what I'd seen with everything I'd been taught. The clean streets. The organized suburbs. The children playing in parks that existed for no purpose except their enjoyment. The abundance of automobiles, each one representing wealth that would have supported entire families in my village. Back at base, the debriefing was perfunctory and carefully controlled. Observation of coastal defenses, I reported to the intelligence officer who recorded my statements in a logbook that would disappear into military files. No significant enemy activity noted. Infrastructure appears functional. The words felt hollow, completely inadequate to describe what I actually witnessed, but I lacked both the vocabulary and the courage to articulate the truth. No one asked what I'd really seen during those minutes over the American city. No one inquired about the neighborhoods, the prosperity, the evidence that our propaganda had been fundamentally wrong about American society and economic strengths. The intelligence officer asked about military installations, troop movements, defensive positions, standard questions that suggested my actual observations were either irrelevant or already known and considered unimportant. The silence felt intentional, as if they already knew what reconnaissance flights revealed and had decided that knowledge was too dangerous to acknowledge or discuss. Other pilots returning from similar missions maintained the same careful neutrality, reporting only technical details while avoiding any mention of what they observed about civilian life in America. The conspiracy of silence suggested that questioning propaganda was not used discouraged but potentially dangerous. In the weeks that followed, he said nothing about what I'd witnessed. Speaking such truths would have been considered disloyalty, possibly treason. But the images haunted my sleep. I'd dream of American children playing baseball while Japanese children worked in factories. I'd walk thinking about electric streetlights illuminating prosperity while my own village remained lit by candles and oil lamps. The war continued. Friends died in battles that seemed increasingly pointless as he understood more clearly what we were fighting against. Not a weak nation on the verge of collapse, but a prosperous democracy with resources we couldn't match and production capabilities we couldn't challenge. The Zero's advantages in speed and maneuverability meant nothing against an enemy that could build 10 aircraft for everyone we produced. I'm telling this story now because that moment over the American city taught me something that stayed with me for 80 years. War isn't just about which nation has superior weapons or more dedicated soldiers. It's about competing visions of how human beings should live. What is shown below me that day wasn't just prosperity, it was proof that ordinary people could live ordinary lives without constant struggle for basic survival. The city represented something yet unknown was possible, a society organized around making life better for its citizens rather than preparing them for sacrifice. It forced me to confront the possibility that everything I'd been taught about strength, honor, and national destiny was wrong. That maybe true strength wasn't the ability to endure suffering, but the wisdom to build something that reduced suffering for everyone. If you want more stories told by the men who witnessed the war from the sky, stories that challenge what we think we know about conflict and humanity, subscribe. It helps these memories survive. Some truths don't explode, they quietly reshape everything you thought you knew.